3 women mocked a black waitress. Minutes later, they learned she owned the entire restaurant. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the pristine white tablecloths of Magnolia's, the kind of upscale restaurant where reservations were harder to get than concert tickets. The lunch crowd buzzed with the soft murmur of business deals and social gossip, punctuated by the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. At table 7, 3 women sat like queens surveying their kingdom. Patricia Whitmore adjusted her Hermes scarf with practiced elegance, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she reached for her wine glass. To her left, Victoria Chin scrolled through her phone with manicured nails that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Across from them, Margaret Sullivan, Maggie to her friends, checked her Rolex for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "I still can't believe we haven't done this in 2 years," Patricia said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Ever since the Hampton House renovation, I've barely had time to breathe." Victoria looked up from her phone, where she'd been showing off photos of her latest European vacation. "Well, you know how it is. The charity circuit keeps me absolutely swamped. Just last week, I organized a $10,000 a plate dinner for the Children's Hospital. The mayor himself attended." Maggie laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You two and your busy schedules. Some of us actually run businesses, you know. My husband's investment firm just acquired another portfolio worth $50 million. They'd been college roommates at an exclusive East Coast university 25 years ago, bonding over their shared sense of superiority and their parents' impressive bank accounts. Time had only amplified these traits, turning what might have been youthful arrogance into something harder and more cutting. The restaurant's atmosphere was everything they'd expected: tasteful jazz music, impeccable service, and the kind of clientele that understood the unspoken rules of fine dining. Fresh orchids adorned each table, and the smell of truffle oil and expensive wine hung in the air like perfume. A young black woman approached their table, moving with quiet confidence despite the heavy tray balanced on her arm. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her uniform was crisp and professional, but there was something about the way she carried herself that spoke of inner strength. "Good afternoon, ladies," she said, her voice warm and clear. "Welcome to Magnolia's. I'm Denise, and I'll be taking care of you today. Can I start you off with something to drink while you look over the menu?" Patricia barely glanced up from her phone. "Finally," she muttered under her breath, loud enough to be heard. "We've been waiting forever." Victoria smirked. "I suppose customer service isn't what it used to be." Denise's expression didn't change, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. "I apologize for any delay. The kitchen has been running at full capacity today. What can I get started for you?" "We'll have a bottle of your most expensive Chardonnay," Maggie said, emphasizing the word expensive as if testing whether the waitress would understand. "And make sure it's properly chilled. Last time I was at a place like this, they served wine at room temperature. Absolutely barbaric." "Of course," Denise replied smoothly. "We have an excellent 2019 Domaine William Fevre Chablis Grand Cru that I think you'll enjoy. It's been perfectly temperature-controlled in our wine cellar." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "How would you know what we'd enjoy? Do you even know what a Grand Cru is?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Other diners at nearby tables began to glance over, sensing the tension building at table 7. Denise's smile never wavered, though her grip on the tray tightened almost imperceptibly. A Grand Cru refers to the highest classification in Chablis, indicating vineyards with the best terroir and optimal sun exposure. The 2019 Fevre has beautiful mineral notes, with hints of citrus and a crisp finish that pairs excellently with our seafood selections. Victoria laughed, the sound harsh and unwelcome in the refined atmosphere. "Well, aren't you just full of surprises? Did you memorize that from a wine magazine?" She probably Googled it on her break, Maggie added, and all 3 women dissolved into giggles that seemed to echo longer than they should have. Denise stood perfectly still, her professional composure intact despite the obvious insult. I'll get that bottle for you right away. Have you had a chance to review our lunch menu? Oh, we'll need a few more minutes, Patricia said with exaggerated sweetness. Some of us actually read the descriptions instead of just memorizing them. As Denise walked away, the women leaned in like conspirators sharing state secrets. Can you believe the attitude on that one? Victoria whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. Acting like she knows something about wine. I bet she's never even been to France. Margaret nodded sagely. It's always the same story. Give them a job at a nice place, and suddenly they think they're sophisticated. My cleaning lady tried to give me decorating advice last month. The audacity! Patricia sipped her water and grimaced. Even the water glasses have spots. Honestly, the help these days just doesn't take pride in their work. When I was growing up, service staff knew their place. Remember Sarah from Delta Gamma? Victoria asked, referring to their old sorority. She manages 3 restaurants in Manhattan now. She says the biggest problem is finding reliable staff who understand that customer service is about knowing when to speak and when to listen. Exactly, Maggie agreed. This girl clearly never learned that lesson. Walking around here like she owns the place. They continued their critique, dissecting everything from Denise's posture to her pronunciation, their voices growing bolder with each passing minute. Other diners began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, but the 3 women seemed oblivious to the growing tension in the room. When Denise returned with their wine, expertly presenting the bottle and performing the traditional tasting ritual, they barely acknowledged her skill. Instead, they nitpicked everything: the temperature, too cold; the pour, too generous; even the way she held the bottle, too casual. You know, Patricia said as Denise finished serving, at the country club, they train their staff properly. Maybe you should consider applying there. They might teach you some refinement. Victoria giggled. Oh, but Patricia, do they even hire? She trailed off meaningfully, letting the implication hang in the air. Denise's hand paused for just a moment as she placed the bottle in the ice bucket. When she looked up, her eyes met Patricia's directly, a gaze so steady and unflinching that for a moment, Patricia felt something she rarely experienced: uncertainty. I'll give you ladies a few more minutes to decide on your lunch selections, Denise said quietly, her voice carrying a note that none of them quite recognized. As she walked away, the 3 women exchanged glances and burst into fresh laughter, completely missing the way several other diners had begun to watch their table with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disgust. This is going to be quite the lunch, Maggie said, raising her glass in a mock toast. None of them noticed the distinguished gentleman at the corner table who had stopped eating entirely, his attention now focused completely on their conversation. His notebook lay open beside his plate, and he'd begun to write with the intensity of someone who had just witnessed something significant. The stage was set, the players in position, and the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight Table 7 like actors in an unfolding drama that none of them, except perhaps one, truly understood. In the far corner of Magnolia's, partially hidden behind a marble pillar and a carefully positioned potted palm, sat a man who had perfected the art of observation. Malcolm Price looked unremarkable at first glance, medium height, graying temples, wearing a simple navy blazer that could have come from any department store. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected the soft restaurant lighting as he cut into his pan-seared salmon, but his attention wasn't on his food. Malcolm had built his reputation as the most feared food critic in the city not just because he could detect whether a sauce had been reduced properly or if the pasta was a minute overcooked. What made him legendary, and occasionally dreaded, was his ability to read the soul of a restaurant. He wrote about more than flavor profiles and presentation. He captured the essence of places, the stories they told through every interaction between staff and customer. He'd come to Magnolia's today on a tip from a colleague who'd insisted the restaurant had undergone some kind of transformation over the past year. It's like a completely different place, she'd said. You need to experience it for yourself. Malcolm had been skeptical. He'd reviewed Magnolia's 3 years ago and found it competent but unremarkable, the kind of establishment that survived on location rather than innovation. But from the moment he'd walked in, something had felt different. The flow of service seemed more intentional, the menu more thoughtful. Even the wine list showed a curator's touch that hadn't been there before. Someone with real knowledge, and real passion, had been at work here. His trained eye had immediately catalogued the changes. The strategic lighting that made every table feel intimate. The carefully curated playlist that somehow managed to be sophisticated without being stuffy. The way the servers moved with purpose rather than just going through motions. This wasn't the same restaurant he'd visited before. Then he'd noticed table 7. Malcolm had witnessed his share of difficult customers over the years. Food critics, by nature, attracted stories from restaurant staff about demanding patrons and impossible requests. But what he was observing now went far beyond the usual complaints about temperature or timing. This was cruelty dressed up as sophistication. He watched the 3 women with growing disgust, noting how their voices carried just loud enough to be heard by surrounding tables. Their behavior was performative, designed to establish their superiority not just over their server, but over anyone within earshot who might dare to judge them. But it was the waitress who truly captured his attention. Malcolm had interviewed hundreds of restaurant workers over his career, from nervous line cooks to veteran servers who could handle a 12-table section with military precision. He knew how to read body language, how to spot someone who was struggling versus someone who was simply focused. This woman was neither struggling nor merely focused. She was commanding. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. The way she moved through the dining room wasn't the rushed efficiency of someone trying to please multiple tables. It was the measured confidence of someone who owned every step she took. When she paused at table 12 to check on an elderly couple, her smile was genuine, warm. When she passed the kitchen window, Malcolm noticed the chef glance up and nod with what looked suspiciously like deference. Most telling of all was how she handled the abuse from table 7. Lesser servers would have either crumbled under the pressure or shown flashes of anger. This woman absorbed their insults like armor-absorbing arrows, not because she was numb to them, but because she understood something they didn't. Malcolm pulled out his leather notebook, the same one he'd carried to over 1,000 restaurant reviews. His pen moved across the page in quick, precise strokes. Subject displays unusual composure under extreme provocation. Maintains professional standards while exhibiting subtle signs of authority. Kitchen staff interaction suggests respect beyond typical server relationship. Wine knowledge extensive, genuine, not scripted. Posture and movement patterns inconsistent with traditional service role. He looked up from his notes to see the woman returning to table 7 with their appetizers. The 3 customers had moved on from critiquing her service to making increasingly personal comments about her appearance, her background, even speculating about her education with the kind of casual cruelty that made Malcolm's stomach turn. Probably never even finished high school, one of them was saying, her voice pitched to Carrie. They just don't value education the way we do. Another laugh, harsh as breaking glass. My maid has better grammar, honestly. Malcolm watched the waitress arrange their plates with practiced precision, her movements economical and graceful. She didn't flinch at their words, didn't hurry her service despite their obvious attempt to humiliate her. Instead, she performed each task with a care that bordered on artistry, the way she positioned each plate, ensuring the presentation was perfect, how she refilled water glasses without being asked, the subtle adjustment she made to their silverware placement. This wasn't just good service. This was someone who cared deeply about every detail of the dining experience. Someone who took personal pride in excellence even when faced with customers who clearly didn't deserve it. Malcolm's pen moved again. Maintains quality standards despite hostile environment. Attention to detail suggests personal investment beyond paycheck. Behavior inconsistent with disengaged employee. As the woman walked away from table 7, Malcolm noticed something else. She stopped at table 3, where a young couple was celebrating what appeared to be an anniversary, and made a subtle gesture to another server. Moments later, a small plate of complimentary dessert appeared at their table, perfectly timed with their coffee service. That wasn't random kindness, that was management thinking. Someone with the authority to make decisions about comps and special touches. Someone who understood that creating memorable experiences was what separated good restaurants from great ones. Malcolm's curiosity deepened into something approaching certainty. He'd spent enough time in kitchens and dining rooms to recognize the signs. This wasn't just a server having a bad day with difficult customers. This was someone in charge, someone with real authority, choosing to work the floor for reasons he couldn't yet understand. The question wasn't whether she had power in this restaurant. It was why she was choosing not to use it. As he watched her interaction with the anniversary couple, saw their faces light up with surprised delight, Malcolm felt the familiar tingle that came with uncovering a real story. This wasn't going to be just another restaurant review. This was going to be something much more interesting. The lunch rush was reaching its peak when the first subtle sign appeared. Malcolm watched as Denise approached table 11, where a businessman was gesturing emphatically at his lunch companion, clearly agitated about something. She bent down to listen, her expression serious and attentive. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," Malcolm heard her say. "Our sommelier made an error with your wine pairing. This Pinot Grigio simply doesn't complement the duck confit properly. Let me correct this immediately." Without consulting anyone, without disappearing to check with management, Denise simply nodded to the bartender across the room. Within minutes, a different bottle appeared, a rich burgundy that transformed the businessman's expression from irritation to surprise, then genuine pleasure. At table 7, Patricia was mid-sentence in another cutting observation. "Probably doesn't even know what half these wines cost. I bet she's never tasted anything better than box wine." If only they knew, Malcolm thought, making another note. He'd witnessed the wine change, and it wasn't the decision of someone following a script. That was the choice of someone who understood food and wine intimately, someone with the authority to make expensive corrections without asking permission. 20 minutes later, another revelation. A family at table 15 was clearly celebrating something special. Malcolm could see balloons tied to the little girl's chair and wrapping paper scattered around their feet. The parents looked slightly overwhelmed by the upscale menu, whispering to each other about prices. Denise appeared at their table like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Malcolm couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he caught fragments. "Our children's menu has some wonderful options that aren't listed. And I can have the chef prepare something special." Within minutes, she disappeared toward the kitchen. Malcolm watched through the service window as she spoke directly to the head chef, not handing over an order, but having what appeared to be a consultation. The chef nodded, smiled, and immediately began working on something that clearly wasn't on the standard menu. The three women at table 7 had moved on to discussing their various charitable endeavors, each trying to outdo the others in demonstrations of their generosity and social importance. They were completely oblivious to the small drama playing out around them, too focused on their own performance to notice the subtle choreography of exceptional service happening under their noses. "The Children's Hospital Gala raised over 200,000, Victoria was saying. "Of course, I personally organized the entire silent auction. You have to know how to manage these people properly." Margaret nodded sagely. "Leadership is everything. Some people are born with it, others." She glanced meaningfully in Denise's direction as she passed their table. "Will never understand what it means to take real responsibility." If they only knew, Malcolm thought again, watching as Denise paused at the host station. She spoke briefly with the maitre d', and Malcolm noticed him pull out what looked like a reservation book. They had a quick, quiet discussion, with the maitre d' nodding and making notes. Then Denise glanced toward the kitchen, made some kind of calculation, and pointed to a specific table that had just been cleared. This wasn't a server checking break schedules. This was someone managing floor capacity and timing, making decisions that affected the entire restaurant's flow. The proof came 10 minutes later when a party of 6 walked in without a reservation. In most upscale restaurants, they would have been politely turned away or asked to wait an hour. Instead, the maitre d' smoothly guided them to the exact table Denise had indicated, and somehow the kitchen's timing adjusted to accommodate them seamlessly. Malcolm had seen enough restaurants operate to know that level of coordination didn't happen by accident. Someone was orchestrating the entire experience, and it wasn't the harried-looking manager he glimpsed occasionally through the kitchen doors. The most telling moment came when a server, a young man who looked fresh out of college, approached Denise near the beverage station. Malcolm couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was unmistakable. The young man was asking for guidance, and Denise was giving it with the patient authority of someone used to teaching, used to leading. She demonstrated something with her hands, gestured toward a specific table, then watched as the server nodded and hurried off to implement whatever instruction she'd given. When the server returned 5 minutes later with a satisfied customer, Denise smiled with the pride of a mentor watching a student succeed. At table 7, the women had finally received their entrees and found new ammunition for their cruelty. The plates were works of art, carefully composed presentations that spoke to a chef with real vision, but they focused on the service instead. She took forever to explain the specials, Patricia complained, cutting into her perfectly cooked salmon. As if we couldn't read the menu ourselves. And did you see how she kept looking around while she was talking to us? Victoria added. Like she had somewhere more important to be. The nerve! Malcolm almost laughed at the irony. Denise had been looking around because she was monitoring the entire dining room, ensuring every table received the attention it deserved. She was multitasking on a level that would have impressed a seasoned restaurant manager, all while enduring their constant stream of insults. The final piece of evidence came when a minor crisis erupted at table 18. An elderly woman had apparently developed an allergic reaction to something in her appetizer. Malcolm watched as Denise appeared instantly, taking charge of the situation with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled similar emergencies before. She didn't panic, didn't run for help. Instead, she coordinated the response like a conductor leading an orchestra. The server brought water, the busboy cleared the problematic dish, and somehow, Malcolm wasn't even sure how, a replacement appeared within minutes, along with a sincere apology and what looked like a complimentary dessert for the woman's companion. The entire incident was handled so smoothly that most diners didn't even notice it had happened. That wasn't luck or good training. That was leadership under pressure, the kind of crisis management that came from real experience and genuine authority. Malcolm closed his notebook and sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. He'd come here expecting to write a routine review of a renovated restaurant. Instead, he'd stumbled onto something far more interesting, a mystery wrapped in excellent service and disguised as an ordinary lunch shift. The question was no longer whether Denise had real power in this restaurant. The question was why someone with that much authority was choosing to endure the abuse from table 7 instead of simply throwing them out. That answer, Malcolm suspected, was going to make for a very interesting story indeed. The atmosphere in Magnolia's had grown increasingly tense as the afternoon wore on. What had started as whispered cruelty at table 7 had escalated into something much more public and poisonous. The three women, emboldened by wine and their own sense of superiority, had abandoned all pretense of discretion. I'm telling you, this is exactly what's wrong with society today, Patricia declared, her voice carrying across half the dining room. She waved her fork dramatically, a piece of salmon still clinging to the tines. No one teaches them proper respect anymore. They think they're entitled to talk back to their betters. Victoria nodded enthusiastically, her earlier restraint completely abandoned. My husband's company had to fire 3 people last month for exactly this kind of attitude problem. They just don't understand hierarchy. Margaret leaned forward conspirationally, but made no effort to lower her voice. It's breeding, really. Some families just don't instill proper values. Look at how she walks around here, like she owns the place. She laughed at her own observation, completely missing the truth hidden in her words. Other diners had begun to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The elderly couple at table 12 kept glancing over with worried expressions. The family with the birthday girl had gone quiet, their celebration dampened by the toxic energy radiating from across the room. Even the business lunch at table 15 had paused their conversation to watch the spectacle unfold. But the three women were too intoxicated by their own cruelty to notice or care about their audience. When Denise approached to clear their main course plates, Patricia held up her hand like a traffic cop stopping oncoming cars. Actually, wait. We need to discuss something with you. Denise paused, her hands steady on the plates despite what Malcolm could see was growing tension in her shoulders. Of course. How can I help you? Well, Patricia began with exaggerated sweetness. We've been watching you today, and we think you could benefit from some constructive feedback. Victoria giggled. Oh yes, we're practically experts at managing staff. Between our various positions on charity boards and Patricia's experience with household help. The thing is, Margaret interrupted, you seem to have confused yourself about your role here. This is fine dining, not some casual little cafe where you can chat with customers and act like you're part of the conversation. Denise's expression remained professionally neutral, but Malcolm noticed her grip tighten almost imperceptibly on the plates. I apologize if my service hasn't met your expectations. Is there something specific I can improve? Patricia laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. Oh honey, it's not about improvement. It's about knowing your place. People like you, she paused meaningfully, need to understand that in establishments like this, there's a natural order. You serve, we receive service. It's really that simple. The restaurant had gone almost completely silent now. Even the background jazz seemed to fade into nothing as every conversation stopped. Every diner turned to watch the ugly scene unfolding at table 7. You should be grateful for the tips you get, Victoria added, pulling a $20 bill from her purse and waving it like a prop. Some people forget that service industry jobs are about gratitude. Maybe if you showed a little more appreciation for your customers' generosity, instead of acting like you're doing us a favor by working here. Margaret finished with a cruel smile. That's when Malcolm Price had had enough. He stood up from his corner table with deliberate slowness, his chair scraping against the marble floor in the profound silence. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward him as he approached table 7, his footsteps echoing like a judge walking to the bench. Ladies, he said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the hushed dining room. I believe you've made your point. Patricia looked up with irritation. Excuse me? This is a private conversation. Malcolm smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, given that you've involved the entire restaurant in your private conversation, I think we're all part of it now. He gestured to the silent diners around them. And speaking as someone who has spent considerable time observing human behavior in restaurants, I feel qualified to offer some feedback of my own. Victoria's face flushed red. Who do you think you are? You can't just interrupt. Malcolm Price, he said simply, letting the name hang in the air. Food critic for Metropolitan Dining magazine. Perhaps you've read my reviews? The color drained from Margaret's face as the implications hit her. Metropolitan Dining was the most influential food publication in the city. A negative review from Malcolm Price could destroy a restaurant's reputation overnight. Or in this case, destroy the reputation of anyone foolish enough to behave badly in front of him. No, Malcolm continued, his voice still dangerously quiet. I've been sitting in that corner for the past hour, watching what I can only describe as a masterclass in cruelty disguised as sophistication. You've spent your lunch systematically attempting to humiliate a service professional who has shown you nothing but grace and competence. Patricia tried to recover. You don't understand. We were just trying to put someone in their place? Malcolm's eyebrows rose. Yes, I heard that part. Along with your charming observations about breeding, respect, and natural order. Tell me, do you genuinely believe that treating another human being with contempt makes you sophisticated? The three women exchanged panicked glances, suddenly aware that their afternoon entertainment had turned into a very public reckoning. This is ridiculous. Victoria snapped, her voice cracking slightly. She's just a waitress. She doesn't deserve basic human decency? Malcolm interrupted. Fascinating perspective. I'll be sure to include that in my article about today's experience. Margaret stood up abruptly, her napkin falling to the floor. You can't write about us. This is harassment. Malcolm pulled out his phone and made a show of checking his notes app. Actually, I can and I will. Public behavior in a public establishment is fair game, especially when it reveals something interesting about character and values. My readers love stories about how people treat service workers. It says so much about who they really are. As the full weight of their situation finally dawned on them, the three women realized their cruel entertainment had transformed into their own public humiliation. And sitting at the center of it all, still holding their dirty plates with quiet dignity, was the woman they'd so badly underestimated. The reckoning was just beginning. Malcolm Price stood at the center of the silent restaurant, his presence commanding every bit of attention in the room. The three women sat frozen in their chairs, their faces pale as they grappled with the magnitude of their mistake. But Malcolm wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "You know," he said conversationally, his voice carrying easily through the hushed dining room, "I came here today to write a review about Magnolia's remarkable transformation over the past year. This restaurant has become something truly special, and I've been trying to understand why." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the other diners who watched with rapt attention. "What makes a good restaurant great? Is it the food? The ambience? The service?" He paused, letting the questions hang in the air. "I've learned today that it's something much more fundamental. It's vision. It's leadership. It's the ability to create an experience that makes people feel valued and welcomed." Patricia tried to interrupt, her voice shaky. "Look, we didn't mean." Malcolm held up a hand, silencing her effortlessly. "I'm not finished. You see, I've spent the last hour watching a master class in hospitality. Not from your server, from your leader." Confusion flickered across the women's faces. They glanced around the dining room, looking for a manager or owner they hadn't noticed. Malcolm smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. "You've been so busy trying to humiliate someone you assumed was beneath you that you completely missed what was happening right in front of your eyes. Every decision that improved your dining experience today, every perfect timing, every seamless correction, that all came from one person." He turned toward Denise, who still stood quietly holding their plates, her expression unreadable. "Ladies, I'd like you to meet Denise Williams. But perhaps I should use her full title, Chef Denise Williams, owner and executive chef of Magnolia's." The words hit the dining room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed from surrounding tables as the revelation rippled through the space. The three women stared at Denise with expressions of pure shock, their mouths opening and closing like fish pulled from water. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Malcolm pulled out his phone and began reading from his notes app. "Actually, it's quite well documented. Chef Williams graduated summa cum laude from the Culinary Institute of America, trained under James Beard Award winner Marcus Beaumont in Paris, and spent 5 years as sous chef at Le Bernardin in New York before returning here to transform this establishment." He looked up from his phone, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. "She purchased Magnolia's 18 months ago when it was on the verge of bankruptcy, and has since turned it into one of the most sought-after reservations in the city. The waiting list for dinner service is currently 3 weeks long." Margaret's face had gone ashen. But she was serving us." "She was working her own dining room," Malcolm finished. "Which, if you knew anything about the restaurant industry, you'd recognize as the mark of a chef who truly cares about every aspect of the guest experience. The greatest restaurateurs don't hide in their offices. They're out here, ensuring that every detail meets their standards." Denise finally spoke, her voice calm and clear. "I work the floor during lunch service twice a week. It helps me stay connected to our guests and support my team." She looked directly at the three women, and for the first time all afternoon, they saw her for who she really was. "It also reminds me why hospitality matters." The businessman at table 11 suddenly stood up and began to applaud. Within seconds, the entire restaurant had erupted in applause, with diners rising from their seats to show their respect for both Denise and Malcolm's intervention. Patricia buried her face in her hands. "Oh God! Oh my God!" Malcolm wasn't finished with his revelation. "Chef Williams has been featured in Food and Wine magazine twice this year. Her signature duck confit, which you just finished eating, was called Transcendent by the New York Times food critic last month. She's been nominated for a James Beard Award for Outstanding Chef. He paused to let that sink in before delivering the final blow. And in 3 hours, I have a scheduled interview with her to discuss her innovative approach to modern American cuisine and her philosophy on creating inclusive dining experiences. Victoria looked like she might faint. We didn't know. How could we have known? Denise stepped forward, her dignity intact despite everything they'd put her through. You couldn't have known my credentials, she said quietly. But you could have chosen to treat me with basic human respect regardless of who you thought I was. The simple truth of her words hit harder than any accusation could have. Around the dining room, other guests nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears at the power of the moment. Malcolm smiled with genuine warmth as he looked at Denise. Chef Williams, I think our interview today is going to be even more interesting than I originally planned. The story of resilience, excellence, and grace under pressure. Your readers are going to love meeting the real you. He turned back to the three women, his expression hardening again. As for you ladies, I think you've provided more than enough material for a very different kind of story. One about the importance of character, the danger of assumptions, and what happens when cruelty meets consequence. Margaret stood up shakily, reaching for her purse. We should go. Yes, Malcolm agreed. I think that would be best. For everyone. As the three women gathered their belongings with trembling hands, the weight of their humiliation pressing down on them like a physical force, Denise remained gracious to the end. I hope you enjoyed your meal, she said simply. It was the final, devastating kindness, professional courtesy maintained even in the face of their cruelty. As they stumbled toward the exit, past tables full of diners who now knew exactly who they were and what they'd done, the contrast between Denise's character and their own had never been clearer. The unmasking was complete, but the story was far from over. The three women made their way toward the exit like condemned prisoners walking to their fate, each step heavier than the last. The dining room that had welcomed them 2 hours earlier with warm lighting and soft jazz now felt like a courtroom where they'd been found guilty of the worst kind of crime, cruelty disguised as sophistication. Patricia fumbled with her credit card at the host station, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it twice. The same maitre d' who had greeted them with professional courtesy now watched with barely concealed satisfaction as she signed the receipt, adding what Malcolm noted was an embarrassingly small tip given their earlier boasts about generosity. The valet will bring your car around, the maitre d' said with perfect politeness, though his tone carried just enough chill to let them know exactly how he felt about their behavior. As they waited by the entrance, Victoria whispered frantically to her companions. Do you think he'll really write about this? I mean, people don't actually read restaurant reviews for the gossip, right? Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Malcolm Price has 2 million followers on social media, Victoria. His articles get shared thousands of times. By tomorrow morning, everyone we know will have read about this. Patricia stared back into the dining room, where Denise was now moving from table to table, receiving congratulations and praise from guests who finally understood what they'd witnessed. We could sue, she said weakly. Defamation or something. For what? Reporting exactly what we said and did in public? Margaret shook her head. We did this to ourselves. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had completely transformed. What had been tense and uncomfortable an hour ago was now warm with shared purpose and community. Diners who had been strangers were now talking to each other, united by the extraordinary scene they'd witnessed. Malcolm had returned to his corner table and was writing furiously in his notebook, occasionally looking up to observe Denise as she graciously accepted the support of her customers. The elderly couple from table 12 had insisted on shaking her hand, the woman tearfully thanking her for her grace under pressure. I used to be a teacher, the elderly woman said, her voice carrying across the quieter restaurant. I saw that kind of bullying in my classroom, and I always regretted not speaking up sooner. You handled that with more dignity than I ever could have. The family with the birthday girl had approached as well, the parents wanting to thank Denise personally for the special treatment their daughter had received. You made her day so special, the mother said. Even with everything else that was happening, you never let it affect her experience. Denise smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Malcolm had seen from her all afternoon. Children's birthdays are sacred, she said simply. Nothing should be allowed to dim that joy. At his table, Malcolm was crafting what he already knew would be one of the most important pieces he'd ever written. His fingers moved across his phone screen as he outlined the article. The True Measure of Character, a Lesson in Leadership at Magnolia's. What happens when privilege meets prejudice in one of the city's finest restaurants? Last Tuesday, I witnessed both the worst and best of human nature played out over a 3-course lunch that will change how I think about hospitality forever. He paused, looking up to see Denise approaching his table. She moved with the same quiet confidence she'd maintained all afternoon, but now there was something lighter in her step, as if a weight had been lifted. Mr. Price, she said, extending her hand. I believe we have an interview scheduled? Malcolm stood and shook her hand, noting the firm grip and callous fingers that spoke of countless hours in professional kitchens. Chef Williams, it would be my absolute honor. Though I have to say, you've already given me more material than I expected. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in summer breeze. I suppose you could say it's been an educational afternoon for everyone involved. They sat down together, and Malcolm pulled out his recorder. Before we talk about your culinary philosophy, I have to ask, why didn't you identify yourself earlier? You could have ended their behavior with a single word. Denise was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Because the moment I pulled rank, it would have become about power instead of character. They needed to show who they really were, just like everyone else in this room needed to see it. Sometimes the most important lessons happen when people think no one important is watching. Malcolm nodded, understanding completely. And what do you think they learned today? That respect isn't something you earn through credentials or bank accounts, Denise said. It's something you give freely to every person you encounter, because that's what decent human beings do. Outside, the 3 women climbed into Patricia's Mercedes, their afternoon of entertainment having become their worst nightmare. As they drove away, Patricia's phone began buzzing with notifications. Malcolm's preliminary post was already going viral on social media. Inside Magnolia's, the interview continued as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a dining room filled with people who had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the revelation of hidden identity, but the power of maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty. By evening, #Magnolia's Moment was trending citywide. By morning, Chef Denise Williams would be booked solid for the next 6 months, her restaurant's reputation elevated not just by the quality of her food, but by the content of her character. The 3 women who had tried to humiliate her had instead given her the greatest gift possible, a public demonstration of everything that made her exceptional. Their cruelty had backfired so completely that it had become a celebration of everything they weren't. Justice, it turned out, tasted even better than the duck confit.